Thank you, Philip. Well, it's good to see the brave souls that are sticking it out for this thing. You don't have to chase the weather home or let it chase you home. So, I'm just going to skip through this slide. I usually give this presentation to producers, and part of my survey asks, why they're here. Maybe, do you have a problem? Do your friends think you have a problem? Can you recognize that, or did you just come for the free meal or that sort of thing? So you will not get the brief survey today. But I would like to spend a little time talking about what fescue toxicosis is, because that's fundamental to the issue in terms of managing tall fescue. Fescue toxicosis, you may have heard of, used that term, and it's really kind of the umbrella term for three different syndromes that we see largely with cattle when they're consuming endophyte infected fescue. Those three syndromes would be bovine fat necrosis and fescue foot. Those are the two we probably talk about the least. And then there's also the third one, summer slump, which is probably most familiar to the group here today. Toxicosis symptoms, are fairly well known. They include everything from reduced feed intake and weight gain and lower milk production to elevated body temperatures and respiration rates. We can often see an animal's been on infected fescue we can tell that by their rough hair coat, and they will have lower reproductive performance. In severe cases, fescue toxicosis can result in death. And so just a couple of images to tell you what I'm talking about with fescue foot and fat necrosis. In the upper left image, you see a picture of a cow that's got fescue foot, and you can see the the formation of these kind of gangrenous tissues. In severe cases, what happens is you get restriction of blood flow, and actually we have imagery now that will show altered vascular architecture in the foot that occurs when these animals consume infected fescue. And in severe cases, you can get enough restriction of blood flow to the hoof that it will actually slough off. And of course, then you have to put those cows down. And we often see those kind of events accompanied by a sudden environmental change. So a lot of times, producers will say, well, my cows are doing fine, and then we had this cold streak, and suddenly they start limping. Another thing, if you've ever seen a cow that doesn't have a tail switch, or maybe it's missing tips of the ears, those would be comparable sort of situations, because what happens is the restricted blood flow doesn't allow those blood to get to the extremities. And so then when the cold weather comes in and you don't have blood out to the extremities, you get frostbite and you lose the tail switch or you lose the tip of the ear. So if you're out working with producers and you see that kind of symptom, recognize that they probably have hot fescue and they have cattle that are sensitive to it. This case of bovine fat necrosis is, not necrosis, I've got to get myself straight here. This case of bovine fat necrosis was from a farm in Northern Virginia. It was actually in a bull that had been on a heavy grain diet. They bought this bull, brought it into their pastures, and so they had lush fescue. And pretty soon the animal performance was going down. They thumped the rumen a little bit. Sounded a lot like it had hardware disease. And they thought, maybe it had eaten something that punctured the reticular rumen. Turns out that was not the problem. But what happens is when you get bovine fat necrosis, so this, again, think this animal was coming off of a heavy grain diet, would have had a lot of fat around the intestinal tract. And that fat then becomes necrotic and it hardens and it prevents passage of feeds. In fact, they said that the diameter of the small intestine at its smallest was about the size of a dime. So you can't get stuff out, so you don't take stuff in, and that's why you have this empty rumen and it sounds like hardware disease. Of course, this is probably the summer slump picture that you've all seen, or that you have in your mental viewfinder, as it were. of what fescue toxicosis looks like. We see these cattle standing around in the water. They've got these rough hair coats and higher body temperatures. And a lot of our producers, you know, they don't recognize the problem and say, well, you know, it's hot out there. And if I was a cow and I had to be out in the environment like that, that's, you know, I'd be standing in the water too if I could. But this is, you know, this is really not so much, maybe it's in part an environmental issue from the standpoint of high temperature, but, you know, a lot of that problem is they can't dissipate the heat, just as they can't get blood to the extremities in the wintertime to help preserve, you know, tails, switches, and ear tips and hooves. They can't get heat out in the summertime to stay cool. So that's, you know, that's what's driving this situation. So what's this mean in real terms? You know, we have reductions in pregnancy rates, 15 to 40%. I've seen some numbers. We'll show some numbers today that might actually even be higher than that, depending on how the environment is modified. So you get lower milk production. You have much lower weaning weights. You know, spend less time grazing, etc. You know, it's not good. I guess about the only things that go up are water usage and body temperature. And what's driving this? So this is an image of ergovaline. Ergovaline has this ergoline ring and this tripeptide moiety. And I show this picture. This lysergic acid amide is the same as this ergoline ring here. And this is lysergic acid diethylamide. Anybody ever heard of lysergic acid diethylamide? No. Anybody? Show of hands. Anybody ever heard of LSD? So you'll notice lysergic acid amide and lysergic acid diethylamide, they're chemical cousins. Now, this stuff can get into the body from a variety of ways. And the animal intakes the forage, then you have it in the rumen and through the intestinal tract. And so there may be passage into the blood circulation. There's also some maybe speculation, maybe even evidence that it's getting into the lymph system. And so that's how it's getting into the body. What does that mean in terms of its effect on the cattle? It is going to affect the serotonin receptors and dopamine receptors in the brain, and that causes the decrease in prolactin. The serotonin receptors and receptors on the circulatory system causes vasoconstriction, and then you have a decrease in circulation. Again, think about being a black cow standing in the hot sun, and your way of getting rid of heat is to have open circulatory system, or as it were, open vasculature, so that you can get blood flow to the extremities and dissipate that. And suddenly you say, well, we're going to close that down, but you're still a black cow standing in the hot sun. So core temperatures go up on these cows. And so that's kind of part of what the problem is. Now, I like to be controversial just because I like to poke sticks at people and make them think a little bit. This whole thing, thinking about lysergic acid diethylamide versus lysergic acid amide, maybe start thinking about issues of addiction. And so I kind of thinking about this in terms of fescue. And so first, what is an addiction? From Wikipedia, it's a compulsive engagement in rewarding stimuli despite adverse consequences. And they are characterized by being positively reinforcing and intrinsically rewarding. So they activate the brain's reward pathways and perceived as being something positive. And the kind of the bottom line here is it exacts a high toll on individuals and society as a whole through adverse effects of drugs associated with healthcare costs and the loss of productivity. Let's think about this for a second. Fescue toxicosis is probably costing us well over $1 billion a year across, the livestock industries that use this. Now, I'm not saying that cows are addicted to these alkaloids and so they go back and eat them. Oh, just to the contrary. The alkaloids are causing them to stop eating, which is having part of the negative performance reaction. But I would say it's possible that there is an addictive effect. I was trying to find an image of cows eating seed heads, and I came across this quote where it said, "I love watching cattle enter a new paddock. If its sward is dominated by mature fescue, they eagerly graze seed heads first." Now maybe they like the carbohydrates, or maybe they're getting a hit. This is, in my mind, not the real addiction problem with fescue-dominated systems. I would say it's producer addiction to tall fescue that's the problem. We like it and we keep using it because it's persistent. You know, it will tolerate drought and flood and poor nutrition and overgrazing and other forms of abuse. So it lowers the management requirement. And, you know, our country likes things that are easy. Probably all human beings like things that are easy. But I mean, I think that's why we have taken so well to tall fescue. It's allowed us to get by with less than adequate management. It is, I would say, excellent for stockpiling, and unfortunately, we don't do enough of that. What's going on with that? Why does that work? You may well have seen some of these kinds of pictures. The endophyte, which you hear so much, is just a fungi. Endophyte means within the plant, and that conveys agronomic benefits. So if you look at this Kentucky 31 on your right that has the alkaloid, it's growing right beside this Kentucky 31, it has the endophyte, and it's growing right beside this Kentucky 31 in which the endophyte was taken out. And you can see the difference in performance of that stand. I think this picture comes out of Georgia. A more challenging environment for cool season plants. The endophyte itself is this little squiggle in the left-hand picture, and these fungal hypha grow between the cells, and they are what are producing the toxins. Interestingly enough, a lot of us kind of get the idea that alkaloid concentrations are higher in the summer because that's when we see the summer slump effects, right? Actually, alkaloid concentrations are lower in the summer. Alkaloids are produced by the endophyte, but where do they get the nutrients to do that? They get the nutrients to do that from the plant. So when growing conditions are good, the alkaloids, or the fungus is, let's say, living high on the hog, as it were, and alkaloid concentrations will be higher. In fact, some of the highest concentrations of alkaloids may be in terms of green tissue, may not be in the spring, but maybe in the fall. So anyway, good growing conditions are going to support these higher alkaloids, which will depress prolactin and will reduce or will affect the vasoconstriction or increase vasoconstriction, as I had mentioned earlier. So again, I often am talking to producers, and the question that we have to think about, or that I ask them to think about in terms of fescue, or in terms of their addiction to fescue, is, do I have a problem? And so this is coming from the overcoming drug addiction. So for many people struggling, the biggest and toughest step toward recovery with addiction is deciding to make a change. So do I have a problem? Am I going to make a change? Here's evidence from Virginia about the scale of the problem. We had some agents that decided to sample fescue pastures in the Shenandoah Valley, 26 pastures in these 3 counties, collectively representing about 10,000 animals. 65% of the pastures were 100% infected. 30% were 80 to 90% infected. One pasture had a 50% infection rate. Now, do those numbers apply to other parts of the Mid-Atlantic? My guess would be yes. And I would say that because typically what happens is we get into a drought situation and overgrazing happens, and so things that aren't infected fescue fall out of the system. So we, by our management, have selected for high levels of infected fescue in many cases. So what are our options in dealing with this? We could keep it and make no change and just keep on rolling as we've always done. Or we might consider sampling our pastures in an effort to keep it and work with it, or in an effort to get rid of it and manage without it. And I want to make the statement right up front that it's important to count the costs. If we're thinking about doing this, we need to know what it's going to cost us to do this. So let's think about just, if we're going to manage with it, one of the things that we could do is address fertility management. Possibly we might want to think about changing the amount of nitrogen we apply at any given time. We might want to distribute that nitrogen out. We might want to use alternative sources. And so if you look at this figure on your left, it's got ergovaline concentrations from 0 to 2,000 parts per billion. And they were looking at seed heads versus stems versus leaves. And so you see in going from 0 to 60 units of nitrogen, we do get some boost in alkaloids, but that increase in alkaloids from 60 to 120 units of nitrogen goes up quite dramatically. And we have a similar large increase in the stem tissue, maybe less so in leaf tissue. The other thing I should point out here, in the ergovaline concentration, we're typically thinking about alkaloid levels as being a threshold for a negative effect on cattle anyway, is often thought somewhere in the 400 parts per billion range. So you can see we're well above those thresholds in stems and seed heads, and we're maybe getting close to that when we get this high rate of fertility in the leaf tissue. If we look at ergovaline in response to poultry litter versus the chemical equivalent of fertilizer, we see that in this one study, I think these are fall applications, they had some ergovaline at 400 parts per billion versus, you're probably in the 500 or 600 parts per billion range with the chemical equivalent. And that may be just a function of the nitrogen or the other nutrients in the poultry litter takes longer to mineralize and become available to the plant. We can also reduce our alkaloid exposure, as it were, with harvest management. How many of you have ever heard of patriotic hay? We have an awful lot of patriotic hay made in Southwest Virginia. For those of you who are not initiated, that just means you harvest over 4th of July. So when you get a seed head, and look at this, so seed heads at alkaloid concentrations almost 5,000 parts per billion. I mean, you're blowing the roof off that stuff. So this is in the seed that's harvested 15th of June. Real question for patriotic hay, it may be that alkaloids have dissipated by the time you get to the 4th of July. They didn't carry the study out that far. But what you, again, can see is that by waiting and harvesting late, you're going to greatly increase the alkaloid level in the seed head. And so good hay management is important. It's important to harvest in a timely fashion. Now, some people say, well, okay, you're going to back me up into, sometime maybe in May or very early June for that harvest, kind of depending on where your location is. And, so, and I've got a really poor weather environment, risky weather conditions to make hay at that time of year. So maybe I should wrap it. Well, that's probably not your solution. If you look at this other figure, you see that this study, I think, was done actually with fall cutting. They had ergot alkaloids in the green chop was about 1,200 parts per billion, and you're still in the 900 range when they ensiled it. So if you're going to wrap that stuff, make baleage with it, you're probably just going to carry the alkaloids. And if you look at making it hay, you're down around 300 parts per billion. Not many people do any sort of ammoniation anymore, but if you were able to ammoniate it, you could reduce those alkaloid concentrations even further. So strategies for harvest, and you're going to have to kind of balance that out. I want to harvest it in a timely fashion. How do I manage the weather window? Watch the Weather Channel, I guess. Another thing that we don't do enough of is stockpiled tall fescue. And this slide shows just ergovaline concentration over time. Ergovaline in this case is less than 500 parts per billion. Some studies and some of the figures I've shown you give you total ergot alkaloids because there's more than ergovaline there. That's just the one we consider the primary agent. but probably some of the other other ergot alkaloids that have similar chemistry to ergovaline are there too, and they greatly increase the number when you're looking at total. So anyway, if we follow ergovaline, in this year 1, they were sampling from middle of December to middle of March, and you see that you're up just under 500 parts per billion of ergovaline, and by the time you get out to March, you're around 100. And in year 2, the alkaloid levels weren't as high, but then the decrease, goes down to well below 100 in the second year. So one of the nice things about tall fescue is that alkaloids will degrade and dissipate from that tissue more rapidly than the feed quality will decline. And I showed this table yesterday. I think it's important to show again. If you looked at nutritional quality of hay versus stockpile, and these are some samples that were taken in Southwest Virginia, decent quality hay, 10% crude protein, TDN just under 50%, however. Compare that with stockpiled forage on the same farm, 16% crude protein, 72% TDN. So you've got something, if you would stockpile, it's much better nutritionally, it's better managerially. I mean, would you rather be just changing a gap in the wintertime, or you have to crank up the tractor and haul that stuff out there and deal with the elements, as it were? So managerially, I think it's much better, and it's certainly better economically. And if we put it into the context of tall fescue toxicosis, it's better from a pharmacological standpoint because they'll have less exposure if we can get on to that stuff in January. Now, how many of you have ever heard the phrase, dilution is the solution to pollution? You've never heard that, have you? Okay, well, in tall fescue circles, I don't know, you must have missed it, because in tall fescue circles, that's been a very common phrase. Dilution is the solution to pollution. So this study looked at average daily gain and gain per hectare when we had a nitrogen-based fescue system or a clover-based fescue system. So when I put clover into the system to supply the nitrogen, what's that mean for animal productivity? And so if you look, this is Kentucky 31 versus the tall fescue with the Max-Q endophyte, or Texoma tall fescue with the Max-Q2 endophyte. When we add clover into these systems, the boost in gain is about the same for Kentucky 31 or the two novel endophyte fescues. If clover were diluting the effects of the alkaloids, we would anticipate this black bar to be up here about the same as these nitrogen fertilized fescues. That doesn't happen. So in this case, this is white clover, and in this case, the white clover is probably stimulating some better intake, probably not a big nitrogen effect. A lot of people talk about the crude protein, but it's probably just the fact that it breaks down faster and stimulates more intake. So we're not getting substantial difference, or we're not getting a dilution effect by adding clover. We're just getting an improved intake and nutrition effect. When we look at gain per hectare, the nitrogen systems did better than the clover systems, and you say, well, that doesn't sound too good, but if we look at the net return, there is a greater net return with the clover systems than with the nitrogen system, and that's largely because we didn't have that nitrogen input cost. And if we look, I guess that's all I want to say there. I did want to make one other comment. So it's possible, and I don't have data here to show this at this point, it's possible that those outcomes might be a little bit different if we were working with red clover. There's new evidence that red clover has estrogenic compounds. Biochanin A is the one that they're looking at primarily. And those compounds apparently are have kind of antidotal effects in terms of vasoconstriction. And so it's possible that red clover may counter some of the negative effects of the alkaloids from fescue. And so we just don't have good data to show you right now on that one. Seedhead suppression has been proposed and used as a way to improve animal performance. And you can see some work here in, I think this is in Missouri, where they have no herbicide, or they put chaparral and they were suppressing not only the weeds, but they're also getting seed head suppression. This lower picture shows Grazon, where that was applied side by side with chaparral, and you can see how the chaparral is greatly reducing seed head production. Again, going back to what we said earlier about seed heads having these high concentrations of alkaloids, so this is a good thing. And if we look at some of the data, they were testing animal gain, and in this one study, that's about, what, 0.6 pounds per day per steer increase in the suppressed treatment. Year two, a different study, different farm, and it's about 0.4 pounds per steer per day. I think chaparral applications last time somebody told me is about $10 an acre, so it wouldn't take too much really to see a benefit from the chaparral. And then this last study, a little bit lower level, but this was interestingly enough on endophyte-free plants that they could see some benefit by applying chaparral. These are data on pregnancy rates, and you can see that they've got suppression levels close to 90% for most of these farms, and pregnancy rates are higher, about 89% versus about 80% on farms where they didn't apply chaparral. And then when they were looking at weaning weights and breed back of Brangus cattle, which should have some heat tolerance, you'll see that the animals on these three farms were generally heavier. And the cow pregnancy rates were a good bit better for the chaparral treated versus the non-suppressed. Oops, wait a minute. Now, one thing I wanted to point out here is, where is that plus sign on here? So farm 3, they had equal pregnancy rates, and they had just a little bit of gain for those animals on the chaparral treated. Now I want to point out this kind of footnote. Heavy spring grazing on treated and untreated paddocks resulted in seed head suppression through grazing. The non-treated paddocks behave similarly to the suppressed paddocks. So the point is, I'm not saying we shouldn't use chemical applications to mitigate seed heads, but we could use management to mitigate seed heads. Now if you want to pay the company for their product, that's fine, and that works. And you may not want to graze that pasture that tight. But the flip side of that is it's not really a remedy. And you also have limits in the way you can use that, because you don't want to treat that same pasture year after year after year, or you'll probably lose the fescue from that stand. So, that's a tool in the toolkit. It probably shouldn't be your only tool.
Just when you got weeds.
If you've got weeds,
it's every 4-year, 5-year deal.
And even the weeds, I would suggest, are there. So one, I'm going to say I'm not completely against weeds, and part of that, there's some limited research I saw recently where the guy said he wanted to manage his pastures, and he managed his pastures as uniformly as he could. And then he was looking at animal performance, and you got average animal performance, and that was fine. But actually, there's quite a bit of variation in animal performance. And his student challenged him, and so they started looking at, well, if the pastures are more variable, what's that mean in terms of animal performance? Well, similar levels of animal performance. What was interesting was they were more uniform. By having some of those other plant species in the pasture, those animals have opportunity to select diets that probably better meet needs. And so while it may not match our image of what's nice and well managed, it may actually be better for the animals. So that's my first component about weeds.
Yeah, we tend to think of weeds in a pasture like we do in a crop. That's where we get the problem, because what I'm referring to, a weed in the pasture, is something that's causing
correct.
A problem.
Yeah.
For toxicity or something.
Yeah, and I had another.
Messing up intake.
I had another comment on the whole weed issue, but my memory's getting bad as I pass that 50s threshold, and so anyway, we'll go on. So, should we move animals to warm season grasses in the summer? So these are some data out of Missouri. And they were having animals on fescue. That's kind of the hatched bar versus a fescue Bermuda system, and Interestingly enough, so this is 3 years of data. If you look at the 2006, 2007, and 2008, in the summer, even though they had Bermuda, they didn't see a whole lot of difference in gains through the summer period between the two systems. My colleague Colin Bach out there, he said, look, you know, the Bermuda that we can get and manage, it's hard. So even though we kept it vegetative, we try to keep it leafy. They're just, it's a warm season grass that's more fibrous. They're just not going to do as well on it. Couple of seasons, you see, in the spring they would have had some young Bermuda, and they actually had some improvement in performance. But what was interesting to him, and I think is pretty obvious here, is when you move off of Bermuda in the fall, in all these cases you see a drop in performance. And his point, or his comment was, it just kind of looked like those animals fell apart. And I'm gonna put this back in the context of the addiction scenario. It's going to take 35, 40 days probably to clear the alkaloids out of the animal system. So if they go into Bermuda, let's say, and they're on Bermuda full-time in June, by mid-July that stuff has cleared. They're probably still on that stuff into, you know, late August perhaps. So they've had a period of time where they've had a washout. And, you know, I don't really have a whole lot of personal experience with drug addiction issues in my family, but I gather that people who come clean, as it were, for a period of time, when they go back on, they kind of fall apart. And I think that, you know, this may be a comparable situation. So that's not to say that putting them on a warm season grass is a bad idea. It just depends on what you're going to do with them. I mean, if these are your replacement heifers, you probably need to keep them. I mean, it may be that you could put them on a warm season grass, but you probably need to continue their exposure to tall fescue, with the alkaloids. Now, this is another study that was done in Virginia, and these were different fescue-based systems. And this was, I think, just kind of all fescue, fescue red clover. This one had fescue and Caucasian blue stem, which is an introduced warm season grass. And what was interesting here, you started in June, you moved them to the Caucasian system. And by October, coming off of the Caucasian blue stem, they're at about 350 kilograms versus the animals on the fescue system, which are closer to 310 or something like that. So they've gained substantially. Now, again, if you're going to keep them on farm and they haven't had exposure to fescue all summer, probably not a good idea. But if these are stockers and they're going somewhere else, you know, that may be a great way to go. So you have to think about what's the use of these animals and what's their destination. Should we replace? Another study from Virginia where we had novel endophyte here in the background, and you can see these animals on the toxic material. So again, going back to that idea, well, it's just hot out there. If I were out there, I'd want to be standing in the creek or the pond too. Well, these are pretty mild temperatures, probably low 80s, and these animals are acting this way. Should we replace tall fescue? If you look at some of the economics from that earlier study, the Max-Q and the Texoma, over $100 per hectare versus about 40 for the animals that were on infected fescue. So certainly it would pay to replace the toxic endophyte. Could we do partial replacement? That's been asked, and you know, that looks promising. So the F100 is they have 100% fescue. These are fall calve operation, or 75% toxic fescue in a fall calving operation. Spring is the S novel endophyte 100% versus spring 100% infected, or spring 75% infected. And what you'll notice is if I've got fall calves and I put in, I give them some some novel endophyte, the cow body weights are a little higher for those animals that have some novel endophyte. Comparable if they've got 100% novel endophyte in the spring 100% spring 100% infected, the lowest body weights at the end of breeding, and sort of intermediate there with the animals that have some relief with 25% novel endophyte treatment. Calving rates, again, fall calving was higher. Interestingly enough, the novel endophyte at 100%, they only had 80% calving. And if with a 25% novel endophyte, they had similar levels. Again, you've got this kind of research situation where you're trying to control all the variables in this kind of worst case scenario if you don't have any relief from heat or that sort of thing, and you're 100% infected, you're going to have these very low calving rates. And then when we look at the body weight gain in kilograms, again, spring novel endophyte was about the highest, similar to fall with a 25% replacement. So that suggests, and the lowest rates of gain for those systems that were largely infected in spring calving. So this suggests that we can strategically replace tall fescue on our operation, use it for helping cows get bred back, and other kind of strategic phases of the production cycle to improve the overall output of the system. Some of the challenges that my buddy Dr. Kallenbach in Missouri says, well, first you've got the aggravation of developing and implementing the agronomic program to get rid of this stuff. We've got to maybe establish a summer annual. I think that's possible to avoid that step probably if we just spray late summer and probably spray twice so that we could graze it in the spring. We want to make sure that we suppress the seed heads in the spring so we don't get new seed development. I don't want more toxic endophyte seed in my environment. I could graze and utilize that material and then kill it late summer and plant my tall fescue. I'd want to spray twice, probably give it about a 3-week window simply to make sure that I kill any skips or misses, that sort of thing from my first spray. I got this question. Well, I'm taking land out of production during this establishment phase. I said, well, yeah, but look, if I'm going to make $100 more per hectare, I can probably afford to give up some of that. Maybe, make that up with hay if I'm not going to destock or that sort of thing. There are risks associated with this, but, those are the challenges. But I've already talked about what some of the benefits are. I've also mentioned yesterday, I talked about silvopastures, and again, this is an area that I've been working on for a bit, so I just take the liberty to introduce this. These numbers are not even mine. These are from some work that Kallenbach did. And so I want you to look here. You've got infected fescue without shade or with shade, and then you have non-toxic fescue without shade or with shade. What's interesting is when you add shade into an infected system, your average daily gain goes from negatives to about 0.3 for the cows. And if you look at cow percentage calving, you go from 38 to almost 90. So that's, my animal science colleagues say everybody blames all this problems on fescue. So the producers, if they had these production rates, they wouldn't be in business, blah, 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 blah. Well, what happens is those cows go find a shade tree or a stream or whatever, and they mitigate the situation. This is a research study, and this is saying this is kind of what the absolute worst would be because in a situation where those cows don't have that opportunity. Our producers, whether knowingly or unknowingly, I shouldn't say the producers, the cows have figured out what they need, and so they've kind of taken care of some of those problems. But if we put it into a research perspective or scenario, this is what you're going to get. You're going to have very low calving rates, and you're going to have animals lose weight. Whereas if we move from infected fescue to non-toxic fescue, again, no shade, we're going to have much higher gain. Interestingly enough, calving percent is intermediate. So in other words, I get more benefits by adding shade back into the system in terms of calving than I do if I just move from infected to non-toxic fescue. So, and then they were looking at weaning weights on the calves, and you can see that by moving from infected to infected with shade, I improve performance. Weaning weights on the calves, interestingly enough, I get a bigger bang out of going from infected to non-toxic. And then if I have shade along with the non-toxic fescue, I have the highest animal gain. So, it may be possible to put another plant out into the landscape, improve the overall productivity of the animals, as well as having a more diversified ag to deal with and buffer against the challenges of climate that are upon us. There are some other options. Alternative legumes like trefoil or lespedizas or crown vetch have tannins. There are a number of studies now that show that animals will change intake if they have tannins in their diet, and they will eat more fescue. And some of the thought behind this is that the tannins will bind the alkaloids. Animal selection, many of our producers have already taken care of that. They got rid of the poor doers. There are some techniques out to determine the level of genetic resistance in the herd. It's a T-SNP test is one of those tests that's available. But if you're just doing stockers, well, you don't have that option, right? So we want to think about this in terms of management across the field or the farm, and what's the profit center? So again, I go back to that issue of what are we going to do with these livestock? Are we going to fall calving operation? Then maybe we can kind of manage around some of these issues. Are we selling bred heifers? Now, that's great if you've got a market for bred heifers. You can show that your stock are better because they're healthier and they're bigger and more productive coming off this novel endophyte fescue. Well, what's the majority of the farm that those heifers are going to? What do those farms have? If you've got a system that say it's 100% novel endophyte, and you move them, you sell them to somebody who's got infected fescue, and they fall apart, what's that do to your reputation? It falls apart too. So it's important to think about where these livestock are going. Again, going to the feedlot, maybe not a big deal. If you're selling for seed stock, could be a problem. What is a reasonable replacement threshold? Some of that other data would show that even 25% replacement would be a useful thing. I know I have some folks here from NRCS, and I'm certainly not wanting to poke sticks at NRCS. Water conservation districts and others that are doing things to fence streams to help protect, to keep these banks vegetated, unlike this picture, and to keep water quality or to improve water quality. I got no problem with that. I'm all for that. But the argument that I make is that in many cases, we are fencing streams as a solution for a symptom. We are addressing a symptom rather than addressing a problem. Those cattle are in that stream because they're stressed, because they're consuming the alkaloids. If we fence them and keep them out of the stream, that's fine. I don't have any problem with that as a management strategy. My question then is, they don't have the way to deal with the heat load since you moved them out of the stream. What are you going to do about it? So I'll just make some conclusions. The issue of fescue toxicosis is not going to go away. The climate change scenarios that we're looking at in terms of increasing temperature, I was showing hardiness zone increases across the United States yesterday in my presentation. It's getting warmer. There shouldn't be any argument about that. There are accompanying environmental and animal welfare concerns that come along with that. We have a lot of options for how we want to deal with fescue toxicosis. I think we need to start thinking about how to employ those. But when we do that, we need to think about this on the whole farm, and we need to manage accordingly. And I will stop there. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them. Yes, sir.
I have beef cattle, I have fescue.
Yes, sir.
I can't replant.
Yep.
So I'm stuck with it.
Yep.
At least in the short term. I have fescue toxicity problems, I know that. Anything I can do in the short term to try and help? Because the hay I'm making is obviously fescue influence too.
Well, let's go back to all those options we talked about. If you can, are these steep slopes or rocky or whatever, they're challenging?
Steep, rocky, you name it.
Yep.
West Virginia, right?
Yeah, buddy.
Yeah. So do you have any wooded land?
Yes.
One option might be, instead of creating silvopasture through planting trees, which that would be an option. Another option might be to create some silvopasture through strategic thinning. Work with a forester on that. Let's think about the grass itself. We talked about fertilization. I don't know what your fertility program is, but you might want to look at the sources of fertility and the amount of fertility and the timing of the application. If you're going to make hay on this stuff, again, do it in a timely fashion. If that ground is not suited for that, obviously that's not going to work. So, those are a couple of things off the bat.
Are there any nutrition supplements?
There are some. There is a product on the market right now. It's some sort of, I think, yeast-derived material that's supposed to help reduce alkaloids and improve animal performance. The data on that are pretty limited to date. So I'm not prepared to say yes or nay in terms of that. What kind of livestock do you have? Is this cow-calf operation? Yeah. So then are those the sites that you could...
This don't work.
Yeah, well, I mean, for the ones that you can stockpile, that's because if this is a difficult site, the reality is if plants are less productive, the alkaloid concentrations may not be as high. The flip side of that is, because it's a difficult site, you would be pretty much assured that you've got high level of endophyte infection. And it may even be that there's higher levels of alkaloids in those plant tissues simply because that's kind of an adaptive strategy for those difficult environments to keep herbivory low. So, if you can't make hay on it, but you could stockpile it. And another thing that you could do is frost overseeding, particularly with something like red clover to try to help improve that. For those pastures that you can make hay out of, do it in a timely fashion, but make hay, not baleage. And then, if you've got other material that you could graze at other times, just trying to think about that sort of strategically. Okay, they got a little slug of this, and so now I can move them, or I need to move them somewhere else to try to reduce their exposure. Those are, I think, all pieces of the puzzle you need to be thinking about. I don't know that resolves your issue, but those are some of the techniques or the methods you could use for that.
One of the good hay techniques, because we have the same problem, you cannot make hay in May. You just can't do it well. You can't. Graze it hard.
Yep.
Get that first thing off, set it back, and then when you get into good haymaking weather, you'll be able to do it before it goes to seed.
Yeah.
That's a big help.
Well, and I think that goes right back to that chaparral studies that show where they didn't have problems, where they grazed hard and they reduced the seed head production. And so, I mean, that may be, these are maybe more fragile grounds, so that's the challenge for you, is to manage heavier grazing pressure without hurting that stand or the soils underneath them. So, that you got to kind of watch that fairly closely. And another option might be to let that be your summer stockpile. If you could just let that grow and maybe you just reserve that for late fall or late summer, and then you graze that out. Your animals have calved, and they're not going to have, the calves are not going to have the milk demand that they might have had earlier on. So then, if they maybe seed heads and whatnot that's there, and you trample that into the ground, so that's helping build the soil on that site at the same time. The negative pressures relative to animal performance are maybe not as big of an issue, and so then you're using that as your summer stockpile and grazing that while you're setting yourself up for the fall stockpile on grounds that are more suitable for that.
And if you do use the chaparral or similar thing, you've set yourself up to graze it further into the summer.
Yeah, right.
Cut that off and make that your winter stockpile. Take a little break there.
Yeah.
And that works out well.
Yeah.
Kind of get 2 years out of it.
All right, well, we're at noon, so we're going to go
Okay.
ahead and stop. I'd like to thank John for coming out.